Okay, so in this example, I'm going to set up a little interactive comic. So I'm going to add a little comment here at the top. I'll call this interactive comic template. And it's really just going to be like we click to go to the next panel. So it's not really that interactive, but it's just a basic example. I'll put the dates for this. And so essentially what we want to do, one of the things that we can use conditionals for is deciding what we are going to draw on the canvas. And so we're going to add in a couple conditions and then see how we can update them using some basic code. So you could imagine if we had a couple panels for a comic, and I'm just going to use P5 graphics for this, but you could use images or whatever else you wanted to use. So let's say I have like a little character, so I'm going to make a circle for a head at, let's do 100, 100, 100. Okay, very simple. And I'll say this is my character. And maybe I'll make some eyes. So I'll do another circle at, let's see, if I'm starting at 100. Now I'm like, I want to use like some variables and stuff, but let's just do, trying to decide if it's too much of a tangent to add some variables. I think that'll actually be useful. Let's add an x and y variable just to review. So let's add a variable x, and I'll set that equal to what I was using here, which is 100. And I'll use a variable y, it's 100. And so I'll do x and y. So I'll just do a circle for the head. And for the eyes, I'll do 1 at x minus 10. And y minus 10, and I'll make it 10 pixels wide.
Wait, what did you do for the variable?
I just have x equals 100 and y equals 100. Okay, so I have one eye. Let's move it over a little bit more. And then I'll just, I'll just copy this, paste, and turn these into this x into a plus, and do my right eye. And then I'll do a mouth, so I'll do a rectangle, say x and y plus 20, and I'll do 50 width and 10 height, and I'll do a little round part. And let's move it back a bit on X. Okay. This part doesn't really matter. I'm just kind of like drawing something. You could draw whatever here. You could use an image. You could just use abstract shapes. But the main point that I want to do is show that we can kind of draw different things. So let's have the character saying different stuff throughout the comic. So the first line of the comic will be, let's say, text, and we'll say hello, and I'll put this at x plus 100, so it's kind of near the character and y. And let's make the text a little bit bigger, so I'll say text size is 20, and let's do a different font. I'll say text font is Comic Sans MS. And let's even go a little bit bigger. Let's go to 35. Or no, let's do 30. Okay, that's pretty good. Okay, so we have our first part, and what we want to be able to do is kind of like go through several different parts. And there's a few things that we're going to be able to do with that will be kind of fun. But let's just build it up bit by bit. So let's say we have our first line of our comic, so I'll call this the first panel, and then I'll draw another panel And for this one, I'll say hi. And I'll draw it in the same place. So if we draw these two pieces of text in the same place, obviously they cover each other up. And so what we want to do is use a conditional to draw the panels, and then we'll use some interaction to move in between the panels. So I can create a simple condition just to decide whether I draw the panel or not. And one thing that we use a lot in programming to save different states is like a variable that just basically corresponds to like a state or a number or a value that we're looking for. So I'm going to make a variable called state, and I'll set that to 1. And I'll basically just like go through and change the state to change what I'm drawing on the canvas. So state just refers to like the current state of something. And there's lots of different things where states change over time, and we have to keep track of those things. So like you can think about in video games, you usually have like a level that you're on and usually have like a score. And the computer has to track those things. So if you go from level 1 to level 2, and then you quit the game and you come back later, the computer has to remember that you're on level 2. So that's the type of state that the computer can remember for us, and that that's part of the way that we interact with different pieces of software. It kind of remembers these different things. So when you close, your word processor and then you open it up again, you see the same stuff that you were just working on there. So we need to keep track of the state of our program. So we're going to use this value called state, and we're going to say if the state is 1, so if state double equals 1, then we're going to draw our first panel. So I'll copy and paste this into here, and then let's just go ahead and tidy that up. Okay, so then we can do another bit here and say if state equals 2, we'll draw our second panel. And actually, I can just hit Command-Shift-F to tidy that up. Okay, so now we just see our first panel, so that's good. And if we change our state to 2, we'll see our second panel, so that's good. But how do we let the user change the state? Okay, so there's different ways to do that, but we can just prompt them. So we need some instructions that say like, click on the canvas to change the state. So let's add some instructions. So I'll go to my index.html and I'll add a paragraph, just like we did last week. Say click on the canvas to advance the comic. I'm using a comic as an example. You could really call this whatever you want. And the text is hard to see because of my theme. So let's go over to the style.css and just change the background of our project to white. So we'll be able to see that. Or you could do a color if you want to do light blue or something like that. That could be nice. Up to you. Okay, so we can change the state here, but we want the user to be able to change the state. Because if I send this to somebody, oh wait, let me save this. So if I save this and I send somebody, let's say I want to share it, but I want to share the full screen version. This is all they're going to see. So they can't change the code, right? The code is something that we use to create the project, but people who are just looking at it, they can't change the state number. We have to do that by going here, and we can change the state to 1 or 2 or whatever. So the way that we can let the user do that is by creating some kind of user interaction. So we can use our mouse pressed function. You could use a lot of different things, but we'll just use a simple mouse pressed. So we'll say mouse pressed, and we'll just say state equals 2. So this is there's some issues with this, which you probably may anticipate, but let's just see if that works to start with. Okay, so that's good. So if I run my sketch, I can change the state from 1, which is what we see here, to 2, what we see there. Okay, so not super exciting, but we're starting to get somewhere where we can have the user change what they see on the screen. Again, this is very, very simple, but it's the basis for basically how all software works. If we're playing a video game and we hit the A button, we see Mario jump. Okay, here we're just clicking and we see the story advance. Okay, So we need to use logic to make this work a little bit better. So we can use logic to decide what to show. So if the state equals 1, we show the first panel. If the state equals 2, then we show the next panel. Okay, so we can also use logic to decide how to update the state. So right now, we're just saying state equals 2. But what we can do instead is we can increase the value of state. So we can say state equals state plus 1. Or we can just say state plus plus. So that just adds 1 to the value of state. Okay, so now we have state equals 1. And we see the first panel. And we click and we see the next panel. Now the problem we have is I click again, and now we're on state 3, but we haven't accounted for state 3. Okay, so let's make a state 3, but we're not going to make infinite states. So if we have state equals 3, this is our third. We can say text says goodbye. So this is going to be the end of our very short comic. Okay, so we have hello, hi, goodbye. Again, if we go to state 4, we haven't accounted for state 4. Okay, so if we want to go back to the beginning, we can use logic. We can say if the state has reached a certain point, then we go back to state 1. Okay, so we can have greater control over what happens in our program. So we can say if state equals 3, and you can make this whatever you want. Your comic can have 2 panels or 100 panels. We just change that number, and we'll get a different outcome. So if the state equals 3, or actually if the state equals 4, because we do have a third panel. So if the state equals 4, we've gone too far. We want to go back to 1. So we just say state equals 1. So this is another really good use of logic, is to not just to decide what to draw, but to make decisions about what's happening in our program and what's happening with our states. So in a game, you could say if you get to 100 points, then you win the game. This is the same basic idea. So now if we have state equals 1, state equals 2, state equals 3, and now if I click again, what happens is state plus plus means state goes from 3 to 4, and then when state equals 4, we go back to 1. So we're just using very simple logic to loop our panels. Okay, so let's make it look a little bit more interesting, but that's the basic idea. Any questions? State plus plus just adds 1 to state. So I'll draw state so you can see it. So I'll draw state, or I'll say text state. Okay, so you see that 1, that's state. Okay, so it starts at 1. When I click, state plus plus means state plus 1. So state turns into 2. Then it says if state equals 4, well, we can see state doesn't equal 4, right? It equals 2. So this code just doesn't happen, because this statement, this condition, is false. So then I click again. Now state is 3. So we went from 2 to 3. We just add 1. And then we do the same thing. If does state equal 4? No, it doesn't. So we don't run this part of our code. So then I click one more time. State goes back to 1. Okay, so it's 3 plus plus is 4. State does equal 4, so this is true. And so we set state back to 1. So yeah, that's the basic idea. So I'll turn this off for a second. And then we can change all sorts of different stuff about our drawing. We don't just have to change what the text is. So let's move our character down a little bit under these state things, and we're going to change things like the color and other stuff. So let's say in our first panel, let's imagine we have 2 characters and one is red. So I'll fill this character red. So we have a red character. And we have another character who is blue. And so then we also need to fill our, oh, I want my text. Okay, let's keep the text black. So I'm going to fill the text black first, and then I'm going to change the fill to red. So I'm going to move this blue fill down. This is just an example. You can leave you can have the text be whatever color you want, but I just want to show that just the character is changing. So then for my last character, it goes back to red. So I'm going to fill black again. Okay, so our red character says hello, our blue character says hi, and our red character says goodbye. And then we go back to the beginning. We can even change X. So I could say in our first panel, X stays 100. Okay, so X starts at 100. But I could change X. So I could say X equals 100. And then I could say, actually, X equals 200. Or let's say 300. And let's draw our text in the other direction. And then we can say X equals 100 again. Okay, so now we have the red guy saying hello, and then we have the blue guy saying hi, and then we have the red guy saying goodbye. So I can draw basically whatever I want, and the things that I draw don't have to be inside of the if statement, but I can change things that affect other things that I draw by adding them into that if statement. So there's a lot of different ways that I can sort of vary what I'm doing with my with the way that I organize the code. Yeah. So you don't need to do this the way I've written it. I could also say, you know, if state equals 1, and then I could say else if state equals 2, and then I could even just say else, because I only have 3 states, so I could just say else here. So that's how we did our stoplight example. This, this might be a preferable organization, but it doesn't really change the outcome. So I would tend to, in this situation, I would tend to write it like this because it's just very clear to read. We have, this is what happens in state 1, this is what happens in state 2, and this is what happens in state 3. And the value state can never be two numbers, so it's always going to be one of these 3. Yeah, I mean, I could do other stuff, like I could make a key press, I could use time, like I could just advance it over time. Anything, you can, there's a lot of different ways that I could change it, but with the program the way it's written, it'll only change based on the mouse press.
How would you change over time?
That's a good question. Let's do an example. So I'm going to save this as is, but I'm going to make a copy, and I'll show you how we would do that. Okay, so if we wanted to change it over time, what I could do, let's get rid of our mouse pressed for a second. So now it doesn't update at all. So I can measure time using frame count. Frame count is just the number of frames that gets drawn over time. So it actually really doesn't matter where I put this. I'll put it at the top just to make it easier. And so what I'll do is I'll say if frame count, well, actually, okay, I'm going to run into an issue if I just use frame count directly, because frame count's just going to keep going up. So what I'm actually going to do is basically exactly the same thing I did with the state, but with a new variable. So I'm going to do it with 2 different things. Okay, so I'm going to use a timer. So I'm going to say variable timer equals 0. And so then what I'll do instead of using frame count, I'm just going to add to timer. So I'm going to say timer plus plus. So I'll add 1 to timer every frame. So let's draw the timer on the screen. So we see that number just keeps going up, right? And it's going to go up about 60 times per second unless we change the frame rate. So let's say we want each panel to show for 1 second, then we would count 60 times. So I can use a condition. I can say if timer equals 60, then I want to change the state. So I'll say state plus plus, just like we did before. And then the thing that I need to do, just like I did with the state, is reset my timer. Because otherwise, it'll only happen once because the timer will just keep going up. So I'll say timer equals 0. Okay, so now when it hits 60, it's going to flip. It's going to go up one state. We didn't account for the state resetting the state, so we have to add that code in as well. Here we're going to see our first nested if statement. So we have a if statement inside of another if statement. So we're going to say if, and this is just the same thing, if state equals 4, state equals 1. So now we see the counter resets every 60 frames, and our state loops because we're updating the state by 1 whenever we hit 60 frames, and then we're starting over again. And if we get to state equals 4, we just go back to 1. And so if I change this number, let's say I want it to be 2 seconds, I can set that to 120, and then we'll wait until we get to 120, and then we'll change it again. So this isn't interactive anymore, it's animated, but that's okay. The main goal of this project is to use logic. Say that again? So it's just this code right here. It's this logic. And that's sort of like the point of using logic is that we have control. We can control things. So we have this timer, and the timer increases 1 count every time we draw. Let's slow the frame rate down a little bit just so we can see that happening. So I'm going to set the frame rate to 5 frames per second. And so now we can see it's counting up once per frame. That's just this line right here, timer plus plus. It's not really a timer, it's more of a counter, but that's okay. And then when timer equals 120, so you'll see this happen as we get to 120. We're almost there. So when we hit 120, timer gets set back to 0. So we go back to the beginning. Let me put this actually first. It doesn't matter what order we do these things in, really. So I'll put the timer first. So let's put some comments, actually. So I'm going to say count up by 1 per frame. And then reset when count is 120. Okay, so set timer back to 0. So that starts us all the way over at the beginning. And then there's a similar but separate process happening where each time we get to 120, we increment the state or update the state. So add 1 to state. And when the state gets to 4, or really when it's, we could also express this as greater than 3. That might make more sense because we have 3 states. So if the state gets to be greater than 3, we want to reset it. So after 3, reset to 1. So let's turn the frame rate back up. So I'll just comment this out. So when we hit 120, we add 1 to the state. And so we go from 1 to 2 to 3. And when we get to 3, when we go over 3, then we want to go back to 1. And so you can have as many states as you want. You could have 100 states if you wanted to make a really long comic. You just change whatever this number is here. But you have to have, conditions that account for the different states. Yeah. The state represents each panel of the comic.
Like individual layers.
Kind of, yeah. Yeah. And we'll use stuff like this when we do some animation next week, where instead of interacting by clicking or moving the mouse, we'll just use numbers to make the computer animate stuff for us. And we'll use stuff that looks basically exactly like this, but we'll, change different parameters. All right, I'm going to turn that off. And so I have a couple examples here. So I'll call this timed comic example. And I'll add this to our examples collection. And then let me open the other one and make sure I add that as well. Okay. So I'll stop this video.